Folsom State Prison, 150 years of psychological warfare. For 150 years, Folsom State Prison has stood as one of California's most unyielding institutions, an environment shaped by strict discipline, maximum security control, and the psychological pressure that comes with long-term confinement. Built in 1880 and documented by the California Department of Corrections and the Folsom Prison Museum, this facility earned a reputation for its intense conditions, its rigid routines, and the relentless mental strain placed on the people held inside. Across generations, inmates, staff, researchers, and historians have described Folsom not just as a prison, but as a system that tests the human mind, where survival depends on adapting to isolation, authority, and the weight of time itself. This is the story of how one of America's oldest correctional institutions shaped the psychology of incarceration for more than a century, and how its legacy still influences modern prison management today. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. The Mind Behind the Walls. Folsom State Prison was built in 1880, during an era when California believed harsh environments would create order. Historical records from the California Department of Corrections describe Folsom as one of the state's earliest attempts at a high-security facility, an institution designed not only to confine men, but to discipline them through structure, isolation, and strict control. Over the decades, researchers and prison historians have noted that Folsom didn't simply enforce rules. It shaped behavior through psychological pressure, limited movement, rigid routines, and an atmosphere where every decision was monitored. These conditions didn't arise by accident. They were part of a belief system dominant in 19th and early 20th century prisons across the United States. Inside Folsom, daily life created a mental landscape defined by hyper-awareness, emotional suppression, and the constant negotiation of power. Many former inmates interviewed in archival materials describe the facility as a place where the mind became the primary battleground. This documentary examines that evolution, how Folsom's methods were built, how they hardened over 150 years, and how their psychological impact still echoes in modern correctional practices. The architecture of control. When Folsom State Prison opened in 1880, its physical design reflected the correctional philosophy of its era. Order was maintained through restriction, surveillance, and psychological pressure. Historical documents from the California Department of Corrections note that the granite walls, quarried by inmates themselves, were built to project permanence and authority. The structure was meant to communicate a single message the moment someone entered. Escape is impossible, and resistance is futile. The layout of the cell blocks reinforced that message. Narrow tiers, heavy steel doors, and limited access points created a controlled environment where movement was predictable and heavily monitored. The design was not only practical, it shaped the mental state of the people inside. Inmates often described feeling as though the building itself was watching them, long before the modern use of cameras or electronic systems. Historical accounts preserved by the Folsom Prison Museum highlight how early administrators relied on silence and separation as tools of dominance. Restrictions on talking, tightly regulated work assignments, and long hours of confinement created a rhythm that wore down individuality. Control wasn't just enforced through rules, it was embedded into the walls, the routines, and the lack of personal space. Over time, this architecture produced a specific psychological effect. Inmates learned to internalize their environment. They adjusted their behavior to avoid punishment, predicted guard movements, and interpreted every sound as a signal. Even today, researchers who study older prisons note that such designs often create chronic vigilance, a mental state where the mind is constantly assessing danger, even when no threat is present. The architecture wasn't just a structure. It was the first weapon in Folsom's long history of psychological warfare. Fear as a system of control. By the early 20th century, Folsom State Prison had developed a reputation not only for its strict security but for the intense psychological pressure embedded in its daily operations. Archival reports and correctional studies describe how fear, both anticipated and experienced, became one of the prison's most powerful management tools. Punishment at Folsom wasn't always overt. In many historical accounts preserved by the Folsom Prison Museum and referenced in correctional research, inmates noted that the uncertainty of consequences was more destabilizing than the consequences themselves. Rules were rigid, but enforcement could feel unpredictable. A man might go weeks without incident, then receive discipline for a minor infraction the next day. This inconsistency conditioned inmates to remain hyper-alert, creating a sense that anything, from a glance to a misstep, could trigger punishment. Isolation played a major role. Separate confinement cells, used throughout many periods of Folsom's history, were described in state documentation as instruments for discipline. But beyond their official purpose, inmates often interpreted them as psychological threats. The possibility of being removed from all human contact with no clear sense of time. Former prisoners in recorded interviews often described isolation not as physical pain, but as something that eroded their sense of self, blurred their thoughts, and made them fear their own mind. Fear also operated socially. In a maximum security environment, relationships were shaped by caution, alliances, and constant risk assessment. Inmates learned to read the behavior of others with precision, tone, posture, silence, because misunderstandings could escalate quickly. This social pressure amplified the institutional pressure, forcing individuals to manage two layers of fear of authority and fear of peers. Correctional psychologists often note that long-term exposure to unpredictable threat creates a state of chronic hypervigilance. Folsom's climate of uncertainty, rooted in decades of strict policy and rigid structure, became part of its psychological identity. Men adapted, hardened, or quietly deteriorated under its weight. Fear wasn't an accident at Folsom. It was an outcome of the system, a tool that shaped behavior long before rehabilitation was ever part of the conversation. When the spotlight hit, the 1960s turning point. The 1960s marked a pivotal moment in Folsom State Prison's psychological history. For the first time, the outside world began closely examining the conditions inside California's oldest maximum security institutions. Reports, news coverage, and state-level reviews highlighted issues of overcrowding, strict discipline, and the emotional strain of long-term confinement. This scrutiny brought national attention to practices that had been hidden behind stone walls for generations. One of the most defining moments came in 1968, when Johnny Cash performed inside Folsom. While the concert is often remembered as a cultural milestone, historical records from the Folsom Prison Museum and contemporary media coverage reveal a deeper impact. It exposed Folsom's internal struggles to the public. Cash's decision to perform for Men's Society had largely forgotten challenged viewers to reconsider who those inmates were and what they endured. For inmates, the concert represented an unusual emotional shift. Accounts from the era describe the event as a temporary interruption of the prison's psychological pressure. Hearing music, laughter, and applause created a rare sense of normalcy, an emotional contrast that many found overwhelming. Correctional researchers often refer to such moments as emotional spikes, where a brief return to humanity makes the return to strict routine even heavier. The visibility the concert brought also contributed to broader conversations about prison conditions across the United States. Advocacy groups began questioning the effects of long-term confinement, limited mental health resources, and punitive discipline. California's correctional system faced increasing pressure to modernize its approach to inmate management, incorporating psychological understanding rather than relying solely on fear and control. Yet despite these shifts, Folsom's internal culture remained deeply rooted in its history. Administrators updated policies, expanded programs, and attempted reforms, but the psychological environment, built over decades, remained a powerful force. For many inmates, the 1960s were a reminder that while the world outside was changing, life inside still operated on old rules. The decade marked the start of a long, complex debate. Should Folsom remain a fortress of punishment, or evolve into a system that recognizes the mental realities of incarceration? Modern Folsom, a new psychological battlefield. In the 21st century, Folsom State Prison reflects a correctional system that has evolved, but not escaped, its past. While many of the harsh disciplinary practices of the early decades have been reformed or abandoned, Modern Folsom presents a different kind of psychological pressure, one shaped by long sentences, overcrowding, and the complex mental health challenges documented across California's prisons by the Bureau of Justice Statistics and state correctional reports. Today's Folsom operates under a framework that acknowledges the role of mental health in incarceration. Programs such as cognitive behavioral groups, educational courses, anger management sessions, and vocational training exist to help inmates reintegrate into society. These efforts align with modern correctional psychology, which emphasizes rehabilitation alongside security. But the core environment remains controlled and demanding. Long-term incarceration affects how individuals think, react, and form relationships. Research consistently shows that extended confinement can lead to emotional numbness, hypervigilance, and difficulty adjusting to unstructured environments. Inside Folsom, these effects manifest in predictable but challenging ways. Daily routines are fixed, and choices are limited. Inmates learn to function according to strict schedules, which can reduce anxiety but also suppress personal agency. Social dynamics are intricate, shaped by the need to avoid conflict, maintain respect, and navigate the unspoken codes that develop in maximum security settings. Even without the punitive extremes of the early 1900s, the psychological tension is constant. One of the most significant modern pressures is the sense of time. With many individuals serving decades-long sentences, the mental toll of anticipating the future becomes heavy. Studies on long-term incarceration highlight how people begin to detach emotionally, conserving mental energy just to endure the years ahead. Former inmates often describe this as living without the ability to imagine something different. Despite these challenges, many incarcerated individuals find ways to grow within the system. Modern programs have produced success stories. Men who learned to read, earned college degrees, addressed trauma, or repaired their sense of identity. These transformations, documented in rehabilitation evaluations and reentry research, demonstrate that even in a maximum security environment, the human mind can adapt in constructive ways. Modern Folsom is no longer the brutal fortress it once was, but it remains a place where psychological survival requires resilience, structure, and constant self-regulation. The walls may not crush men the way they once did, but they still shape how individuals think, feel, and rebuild themselves. Rehabilitation versus punishment, the ongoing conflict. As California's correctional philosophy has shifted over the decades, Folsom State Prison has become a symbol of the national debate over what prisons should ultimately do: punish, rehabilitate, or attempt both at once. Reports from the California Department of Corrections, academic studies on correctional reform, and data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics all show a system trying to evolve, while still carrying the weight of its past. Rehabilitation at Folsom today includes educational programs, substance abuse treatment, trauma-focused counseling, vocational training, and peer-led restorative justice circles. These efforts reflect modern research on criminal behavior, which emphasizes addressing root causes such as untreated trauma, lack of support networks, and limited life skills. Many inmates who participate in these programs report increased emotional awareness, improved decision-making, and a sense of purpose, developments consistent with findings from correctional psychology. But despite progress, the debate persists because the environment itself complicates rehabilitation. Folsom's architecture, routines, and culture were originally designed for control, not transformation. Even with updated policies, the residual culture of vigilance and authority remains. Researchers note that when a facility's physical and historical identity is rooted in punishment, it can conflict with attempts to promote healing and personal growth. This tension plays out in the experiences of the men inside. Some inmates take advantage of programs and reshape their futures. Others struggle to trust counseling, open up emotionally, or imagine a life beyond confinement. The psychological habits developed in maximum security environments, guardedness, emotional suppression, suspicion, can undermine the vulnerability needed for true rehabilitation. Yet examples of change still stand out. Many individuals describe breakthroughs that occurred only after years of internal conflict. They speak of reaching a point where punishment no longer defined them, and where personal responsibility became a form of freedom. These stories align with broader research showing that rehabilitation often succeeds not just because of programs, but because individuals choose to engage with them deeply. The conflict between punishment and rehabilitation remains unresolved, but modern correctional policy increasingly recognizes that long-term safety depends on addressing both. Folsom's evolution reflects this reality. A prison built on fear now trying to make space for hope even when its walls were never designed for it. The legacy of 150 years. For 150 years, Folsom State Prison has stood as a testament to the power of environment over mind and the resilience of those who endure it. Its history, from the granite walls of the 19th century to the modern programs of today, reveals a continuum of psychological influence, control, fear, adaptation, and sometimes transformation. Folsom teaches a profound lesson. Prisons are not just about containing bodies. They shape thoughts, emotions, and identities. The mental toll of incarceration echoes long after release, influencing families, communities, and society at large. Yet within this harsh system, men continue to find paths to growth, demonstrating the human capacity for resilience even in the most restrictive settings. The story of Folsom is far from over. As correctional philosophy evolves and society grapples with the balance between punishment and rehabilitation, this historic institution remains a mirror reflecting our beliefs about justice, human nature, and the possibilities for change. If you want more documentaries exploring the untold histories, hidden psychology, and real human stories behind America's most historic prisons, make sure to subscribe. The next story could challenge everything you think you know about incarceration.